Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Biro Beyer. I'm festival director, and it is my honor to try and encapsulate just briefly the career of a man who will be standing here in a bit and who is, of course, way too modest to describe the hugeness of his work, with over 60 interventions, with exhibitions, I think 4 times Biennale in Venice, in Sao Paulo, at the Tate, in the MoMA, let me figure out, see, there's way too many. Let me just list a few. He's been 4 times in Venice, the Biennale, 3 times in Sao Paulo, the Documenta in Casso twice, the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, of course, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Rome, Stockholm, Hangerbjörka, Milan, Berlinische Galerie und Neue Gesellschaft für Bildende Kunst, in Arles, in Klasma. About 50 monographic publications have been made about him. He's a Guggenheim Fellow and a MacArthur Fellow, and there's more on this list. The guy's great, which means that we're in for a treat. And I'll ask you, though, to be modest in a way that you will not ask questions after. Usually we do that, but I think the presentation will be intense enough for you to swallow your questions for a while. I'm sure afterwards, when we go out and there's more mingle area, he'll be approachable to discuss what he just presented. But it's the kind of work that deserves a very special kind of attention. It's the kind of work and commitment to also a political reality and the role of art in it that IFFR feels is hugely important, and that we should devote a huge element of our work to create that space for that kind of focus. Which means that we're extremely happy, by the way, that he was so generous to also help us in our new frameworks program, where we try to lift up new visual artists and give them a platform. Grada Quilombra is his acolyte. It's a visual artist that he helped us choose to give space for that kind of thinking that he has been doing for so long. So we're in for a treat. I'm sure it will be intense, maybe even emotional. And as you can see, I'm almost getting emotional, because in the presence of greatness, I become very small. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very, very warm round of applause to Alfredo Jaar.
Thank you. What a generous presentation. After that, I'd rather go home and leave you with that. So I'm honored to be here. I want to thank the festival for incorporating the visual arts. I think it's a very risky proposition and very generous to think that we can contribute to your ideas and to your vision about film and about the world. I'm a frustrated filmmaker myself. I've done quite a few shorts, but never a feature film. I'm also a frustrated journalist. So what I am is an architect that makes art. I never studied art. I only studied architecture and film. And so I use the methodology of architecture to make art. And the modus operandi I've used all these years is basically, I will not act in the world before understanding the world. And this is key. And so for this masterclass, which is really a lecture, performance masterclass, I've incorporated not only the work themselves, but the process I've used to reach the essential idea that became the work. I will not act in the world before understanding the world. Because for an architect, context is everything. And so you have to understand the context. An architect cannot dream about doing anything without understanding where the sun is coming from. For me, art is the same. I need to understand. So I would like to share with you the process of understanding before making. May I have the lights, please? Every year, on August 6th, at 8:15 in the morning, Japan commemorates the nuclear bomb that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on March 11, 2011, the nuclear nightmare came back to Japan. That day, at 2 p.m. and 46 minutes and 23 seconds, there was an earthquake. 9 on the Richter scale. It lasted 6 minutes. The waves from the tsunami that came right after were 40 meters high. 15,833 people died instantly. 2,667 were missing, and 6,145 were wounded. And the word Fukushima entered the world vocabulary as synonym with nuclear nightmare. These are the 4 nuclear reactors of Fukushima. And one of them started leaking toxic water, 350 tons per day. And these engineers are entering one of the nuclear reactors to try to resolve the problem. Outside, the radiation levels are 1,000% higher than normal. And after the earthquake came the tsunami. I was invited to create a memorial for the victims. In one of my 4 visits, I discovered this building, which was a radio station that got destroyed during the tsunami. It was from here that a young woman voiced to the population, to the community, go out in the mountains because the tsunami is coming. And she did it in such a passionate way. She wanted to save as many people as possible that she couldn't escape herself and died in the tower. So the community created a small memorial at the base in her honor. You can still see the antennas from which her voice went to the community and saved them. Her name was Miki Ando. I went and needed to understand. I visited the sites of the tragedy. I spoke with politicians, with scientists, with intellectuals, with artists, with journalists. I needed to understand before acting. I visited 5 refugee camps that were set up very quickly, very effectively. It was very moving to see in between these containers how people was trying to recreate the life they had lost. But the solitude of the people living there was intolerable. I found photographs everywhere, on the ground, damaged, destroyed, of people that I don't know, and I will never get to know. I don't know if they're alive. And memorials everywhere. The newspaper was destroyed by the earthquake and the tsunami, but the journalists wanted to keep the community together. So they decided to keep working, and they wrote their news on these large sheets of paper that they displayed outside to keep the people informed. This one displays the names of all the little villages and towns and neighborhoods and the number of missing people the day after. One day I visited a school that had been destroyed by the tsunami. And I learned that many children had died here. I went back the next morning. I was very moved by the story, imagining these young kids between 12 and 15 at school that disappeared. And with the light of the morning, the next day, I suddenly realized that some of the former classrooms still have their blackboards. And I thought, these blackboards are precious. They contain thousands of hours of the gaze of these students who died, inventing a new world, creating a better world. This is where they projected their dreams. I calculated that the students who had died had spent 15,000 hours of their young lives looking at these blackboards. So this is when the work was born. And I dedicated the memorial to them. I titled it Umashimenkana, which means we shall bring forth new life. Umashimenkana is the title of an extraordinary poem by Sadako Kurihara, a marvelous poet and anti-nuclear activist who had died a few years ago. Sadako lived in Hiroshima when the nuclear bomb destroyed the city, and she survived. But her neighbor gave birth to a child the same night, so she helped her. And the next morning she wrote this extraordinary poem, Umashimenkana, celebrating life in the middle of the disaster. I invited a very well-known calligrapher to write this extraordinary word concept on a blank canvas. I wanted to see that word visually. Umashimenkana. For the memorial, I was able to get 15 of these blackboards. I got the permission from the families of the kids who died, but they asked me to clean them up. They didn't want to have any sign of their writing on the blackboards. And we installed them in this very large dark space with enough light just to be able to see them. The blackboards that had received 15,000 hours of the gaze of these young victims. So people come into this dark space, they walk very slowly, they look at the blackboards, and then every 3 minutes, this is what happens. I invited 15 students of the same age than those who died to write with their own hands this word, Umashimenkana. And we project it on the blackboards every 3 minutes. Umashimenkana. We shall bring forth new life. In the middle of the space, I created a small sculpture with colored chalk that I had found in the school, the same chalk that the kids had used to write on these blackboards, inventing new worlds. I wanted a space of color, of creativity in the middle of this desolation. Umashimenkana in Japan. This is Skoghall in Sweden. This is Skoghall City Hall. This is Skoghall's church. This is the main pedestrian street. This is their supermarket. This is a small town, 80,000 people. It's a middle-class town. Skoghall was created 30 years ago by a paper mill, the largest paper mill in the world, called Stora Enso. They chose the site and they created the biggest factory where they started making paper. They brought in 3,000 workers from around the area. And of course, they had to give them habitat and a church and a school for their children and a hospital. And the town was born around the factory. Today, the entire economy of Skoghall revolves around the factory and the paper making. Stora Enso produces this paper called Tetra Pak. Tetra Pak is a heavy paper that they use to make milk or juice cartons. And this is how it is exported all around the world. I did my research in Skoghall, and I discovered that the company, Stora Enso, had financed absolutely every single civic infrastructure of the city. But there was something missing. There was no Konstale. There was no Museum of Contemporary Art. So I rejected the funding that the city offered me, and I asked the mayor to help me have a conversation with the members of the board of directors of the paper mill. He managed to organize this meeting. I gave them a presentation, and I argued to them, listen, gentlemen, you have created this city, and you have given the inhabitants of Skoghall absolutely everything. It is your task to finance a small museum. They accepted. So we designed and built the first paper museum in the world. It measures 20 meters long, 8 meters deep, and 6 meters high. And it's made of wood from the paper mill and Tetra Pak from the paper mill. We layered many sheets of Tetra Pak to make it a little thicker, and we tense it between these beams. The ceiling is paper, the floor is paper, and I left the entrance quite wide to have natural light because we could not use electricity. For the opening exhibition, I invited 16 young artists from all around Sweden to create works focusing on paper. This young artist from Stockholm created this origami table, inviting children to create paper sculptures inside a paper museum, inside a paper town. This one did a survey on the phone with 50 inhabitants of Skoghall and asked them, how is it possible that in 30 years of history you never thought about having a museum? Most people answered, we are fine like this, we don't need one. But they came to see the opening. They wanted to see what a museum is. We had music from the paper mill orchestra, because the paper mill owns everything. And this is Leif Bergman, the mayor of Skoghall, opening the Skoghall Konstale. This is the moment everyone is waiting for, when they can finally enter. And as in any opening, you cannot see anything. So people line up, and during all day of the opening, they wanted to see what a Kunsthalle is. This was probably the most successful work in the exhibition. This is in the middle of the afternoon of the opening and a few hours later. Exactly 24 hours after the opening, we took down the Swedish flag, and we did this. The burning was pre-planned. Everyone knew I was going to burn it in 24 hours. The logic was that the community didn't want an institution, and I was not going to impose it to them. So I just wanted to give them a glimpse of what contemporary art is. Once they had it, I take it away. And I wanted to create a dramatic event to show them what it would mean not to have a space for art. There were some protests. They came to me hours before the burning, and they said, "Mr. Jaar, we understand now what you're trying to do. We love the idea. Please, let's save it." I said, "No, we can't. You know, the first rain or the first snow will destroy it. We cannot keep it." They said, "But let's try to save something, at least the foundation of the building, and perhaps we can rebuild a more permanent Kunsthalle on top of it." I explained that, no, even the foundations are too weak. Besides, I've been working with the fire department for 6 months in order to burn this properly and not to burn the entire town. So we need to finish this project. They accepted. But 1 hour before the burning, another group came. This was a group of ecologists. They said, "Mr. Jaar, we don't think it is right for you to burn this wood. We need the wood to create a playground for children in the middle of the city." I said, but why my wood? You have been making paper for 30 years. Go get it at the paper factory. They said, "Well, we are ecologists. We don't think it's right to burn this wood." So I said, "No, I need to finish my project. I'm sorry." They said, "Mr. Jaar, we're going to boycott your museum. We're going to sleep inside until you go back to New York." So I had to negotiate. I said, "Listen, what if I design the playground for children for free if you let me burn my museum?" They accepted. So a year later, I designed a playground with wood from the paper mill for free. But also a year later, every city in Sweden had to select their most important building for a book on Swedish architecture. And the community voted the Skoghall Konsthalle as their most important building. And they invited me back as an architect to design the permanent Kunsthalle for Skoghall. This is Montreal in Canada. This is the center of the city. And as you walk south, you cross through an area called Chinatown, and you get to the cathedral, which marks the border between the old and the new Montreal. And the old Montreal is a pedestrian area filled with old buildings and cafes and boutiques and bars and restaurants. It's an area for tourists. I was invited to do a project in this tower called the Cupola. The Cupola had been the siege of the Canadian Parliament, but it burned. So it was rebuilt because it's a national monument, and it burned a second time. So it was rebuilt again, and it burned again. In total, it burned 5 times, and every time it was rebuilt. But after the 5th fire, the Canadian Parliament moved to another building. Today it's empty, waiting for use. It measures approximately 9 floors tall. In one of my 7 trips to research this problem, I went on the roof of a church which is 100 yards from the cupola. I wanted to see the outreach of these windows of the cupola into the city. And I could see that people around 6 blocks radius could see the cupola. It was very visible. And one day, I was walking back towards the cupola, and suddenly I see a van. And from this van, I see 3 men carrying large boxes of fruits and vegetables and bringing it to this building. So I became curious. I approached the van, and I saw a sign that said, "Together it is possible to alleviate hunger." So I looked for a sign inside this facade. It was a very small sign, Accueil Bonneau. I rang the bell, and I discovered a homeless shelter, a place where they welcome 1,500 homeless people every day. And they offer them breakfast, lunch, and dinner without asking any questions. I went in, and they mentioned that there were 2 other shelters, very discreet, 2 blocks and 3 blocks away. So I went to see them. This one was in the basement of this church. It's called Refugee des Jeunes. Here they welcome 900 young men and women, and they give them a locker, a shower, and a bed for 2 weeks. And this one is a larger villa, La Maison du Père, the house of the father, where they have small apartments for entire families where they can stay up to 3 months. I was shocked to discover that in Montreal, there were 15,000 homeless people in one of the richest cities of the Western Hemisphere, with one of the worst winters of the area. I started talking to the homeless, and they all told me the same thing. We are invisible. We go out in the streets and no one sees us. They look the other way. And they explained to me that it's not that a coin or a bill would make a difference in their lives. They have a shelter, they have food. It's just that they are trying to regain their humanity. When you look at them, when you say hello, then they become human again. They told me we're invisible. Nobody sees us. We are treated like a garbage can or lamppost. At the same time, they said, "No photography, please. We do not want to be photographed. We do not want to be represented as homeless people." So I went back home and came back 2 months later with a proposal that I asked them to vote. And if the majority agreed, we would realize it. They accepted my proposal. And so this is what we did. Inside the cupola, we installed 100,000 watts of red lights in such a way that when they are lit, the cupola becomes red for just a fraction of a second. like this. And we connected this to a device inside the 3 shelters. I'm going to go now inside the shelters, but I'm not going to show you a single human being. This is one of the shelters. And if you look at the sign on the right side, there's a title of the project, Lights in the City, a photograph of the cupola, and a text that suggests if you push this button, the cupola will go red for a fraction of a second. We had a similar sign here when you go to rooms 1 to 45, and here among job offers. This intervention tries to inform society of the daily situation of homeless people. A red flashlight will illuminate the cupola every time someone like you will push this button. We want to witness your increasing presence in the shelters of Montreal, but at the same time we want to respect your dignity and your privacy. We want to transform the cupola into a socially painful sign. This intervention will metaphorically reproduce a distress signal in the area of the old Montreal and beyond. Let's hope that this action will create outrage to the social conscience and may have the power to transform your condition. So people came at night to have fun, to have food, dance, drinks, and they can see the cupola from around 6 blocks all around. And suddenly it goes red as a sign that another man is entering another shelter. We made the front pages of all the newspapers and magazines, and the TV descended to interview the homeless that suddenly became human beings again. Some kids decided to spend the entire night seated around the button, pushing it because they wanted the light to be on all night. The other 14 shelters of Montreal wanted to join us and be connected to this device. But after 6 weeks, the mayor said enough is enough, and he stopped the project. So for me, this was a portrait of homelessness without displaying faces, respecting their privacy and their dignity. But also the red in the cupola was a warning signal, but not of a fire, like the fire that destroyed this cupola in its history 5 times. No, it's a warning that Canadian society cannot survive allowing 15,000 people to go homeless every night. Lights in the City in Montreal. A couple of years ago, the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize. Some of us were outraged because the EU has become a fortress that expulses immigrants. This is the Nobel ceremony in Oslo, and this is the representative of the EU at the time, Mr. Barroso from Portugal, receiving the prize. This is the same Mr. Barroso that just joined Goldman Sachs in New York. These are the kind of images we have seen coming up from Europe in the last 15 months. The so-called new immigration crisis is not new. It has been going on for quite a while. But before, the faces were black. And they were coming into the south, in the poorest countries, into Spain and Portugal and Greece and Italy. So they were invisible. We are here in Lampedusa, a small Italian island in the south of Sicily, where there is 15,000 people waiting for destiny, for a country in Europe to welcome them. The camp has really become an open-air prison. But this is the image of Lampedusa the authorities would like to give to the world. This beach still exists in the island. I've realized quite a few projects about the issue of immigration, and I would like to share just a couple with you. This is Helsinki in Finland, a very beautiful city, where these days we have these kind of very dark scenes. This is because a new party called the New Finns, now called the Finns, got more than 20% in the polls. And this is an anti-immigration, anti-EU party that wants to expulse the few immigrants that Finland has. A few years before, I was invited to do a project in Helsinki. And I quickly discovered, walking around, to get a feeling for the city, that it was a very homogeneous society. And when I looked at the statistics, I discovered that while Sweden, Denmark, and Norway had welcomed 1 million immigrants in the last 10 years, Finland only had welcomed 17. This is because they have a very restrictive immigration policy based on the fact that in the last 600 years they were conquered both by the Russians and the Swedes. But that year, Finland wanted to become part of the European Union. And I thought this is an extraordinary contradiction. You don't want to have members of other communities coming into Finland, and at the same time you want to belong to another community like the EU. I thought, Finland, you cannot have it both ways. So I created a project to focus on this issue. And my project needed legal help. And it was offered by Matti Worry, a human rights lawyer, president of Greenpeace International, who helped me fight for 6 months the immigration authorities of Finland. And finally, I was able to produce my work, which was called 1 Million Finnish Passports. And this is exactly what we have here. But by contract, I had to display them behind high security glass. Why 1 million? I had calculated that most European countries, approximately 20% of their populations are foreigners or people of foreign descent. Since Finland has 5 million inhabitants, if Finland had a normal immigration policy like the rest of Europe, they should have had 1 million immigrants. These are their passports. With this very simple gesture, I wanted to ask the Finnish community, do you want to remain insular? Or do you want to welcome new ideas, new sounds, new colors, new life? The lighting of this piece was very subtle, but I wanted people to see themselves reflected on the glass. and see these passports through their own image. My objective was to trigger a public discussion about this subject, and it happened. It was very successful in that case. We got a lot of press and a lot of discussion on TV programs and forums about Finnish people asking themselves, why are we like this? But for me, the most moving reaction was a young Finnish citizen that came in the morning. He was moved by the project. He went home and brought back his own passport in the afternoon and threw it on top of the pile as a sign of solidarity. Unfortunately, at the end of the project, we had to burn the passports. And in my contract, I could not film the burning, or I could not photograph the burning of the passports. But I managed to steal 200 passports. And I still don't know what to do with them. 1 million Finnish passports in Helsinki. These, of course, are the images we also reproduced millions of times everywhere. It was reproduced in more than 1,500 newspapers around the world. The press identified this young 3-year-old child as Alan Kurdi, but his real name was Alan Shenu. Alan Shenu came from Kobani, a Kurdish area. And this is his house, and this is his father, the only survivor. Alan died with his mother and a brother. There are no images of them. Only Alan's image is known. The entire city of Kobani is destroyed. And until 6 months ago, there were still bombings. But it's not only Kobani. All Syria is destroyed. That's why there are 6 million refugees around the world. 3 million of those are in Turkey. 1.5 million are in Lebanon. 1.5 million are in Jordan. And that other million is trying to reach Europe. And Europe is panicking for that million. I'm interested in what I call the politics of images, and I wanted to share with you the origin of this image, this extraordinary image. It was taken by this young Turkish photographer. And she sent it to the agency. But she sent it as this. This is the complete image. You see 2 policemen, one of them a photographer. You see 2 people fishing in the back, and a road, a couple of cars. The editor of The Independent in London saw this image that early morning in September and saw its potential. And this is what he did. Somebody's child on the cover of The Independent. And that's when the image went viral. And in the next 3 days, you would see this image or an image of the sequence in more than 1,500 papers around the world. And it changed a lot of minds. This is the Daily Mirror, a very conservative newspaper in England. On the cover, with the text "Unbearable," the same Daily Mirror, a month before, was having these kinds of titles. "Send in the dogs." "Brits facing holiday hell." The Daily Mail suffered the same change of heart. "Tiny victim of a human catastrophe," it says. This is what they were doing before. "Send in the army." "The swarm on our streets," quoting David Cameron. "Or migrants, how many more can we take?" they ask. Le Monde had an editorial on the front page, something that we have never seen, and the photograph on the cover. "Open the eyes," the title. Libération did a different strategy. They had a different image on the cover with the word "act," but they dedicated 6 pages to the tragedy and a spread to that image. An image, a turning point, it says. And another editorial in the next page. La Stampa had my favorite essay. The title, "The Beach Where Europe Dies," by Mario Calabresi, the editor. I repeat, "The Beach Where Europe Dies." The image went viral on social media. Steve Dennis wrote how his story should have ended. This is an artist in New Delhi, in India. This is a performance group in Morocco. This is in the Gaza Strip in occupied Palestine, a school that did an homage to Alan Shenu. This is a mural in Frankfurt, another in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is a sculpture in an art gallery in Helsinki. And this is Ai Weiwei, mimicking the death of Alan Shenu. He was harshly criticized for this performance. The reason was that after Alan Shenu died on this beach, more than 175 people has died on the same spot. I wanted to do something. I wanted to react to this image. So we combined all these images together to recreate the beach, but we took out the body of Alan Shenu. I didn't want to display the body again. So we created this image, which divided by 4 gave me the possibility of creating a cube. And we printed 12,000 blue cubes that we gave away in the street of Basel, one of the richest cities of Europe, during the art fair. We had 37 volunteers that went out to the streets and simply said, "May I offer you a gift?" Once people opened the box, they found a text that warned them, "This gift can change you." And I quote Mario Calabresi from La Stampa from Torino. And then we asked them to open the box completely and reassemble it inside out in such a way that the inside becomes the outside and the outside becomes the inside. And when they do that, they discovered the bottom that focuses on MOAS, the Migrant Offshore Aid Station, which is an extraordinary NGO, non-government organization, saving people at sea and asking them to donate. MOAS is a very young NGO, and they use drones, not those drones that kill innocent people. As you know, some 5,000 people have died killed by drones. People with no names, with no faces, killed by these young Americans in their tents in the desert in Vegas or in air-conditioned offices in Miami. No, not those drones. These drones are surveying the high seas, and when they see a boat in distress, they send a signal, and then the MOAS boats react, and they go and try to save them. This is the only legal way. If you intervene before, you are considered accomplice to trafficking human bodies, and you cannot do it. You have to wait for the boat to start sinking before acting. This is one of the most extraordinary ironies of the law. And so MOAS acts exactly at the right moment. So I wanted to, of course, to raise funds for MOAS, and we raised more than €500,000. But more importantly, I wanted to engage the people of Basel into a conversation with the volunteers. And so sometimes they could spend 10, 15, 30 minutes talking about the project, forcing people to think about this reality. We went inside the fair. We were not allowed, but we managed to do it. We were invited to do the same project in the Adriatic Sea in Italy, on a beach where a lot of bodies show up once in a while. So we continued the project there. We put him to sleep, and it's about time for us to wake up, wrote Galia Altoal. But Europe keeps building fences and walls. But the people is trying to help. Only civic society has done certain gestures to help the refugees, not governments. This is in Greece, in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal. There are countless human life stories, like this baker from Athens that left his job and went to the south to bake for the refugees. But for every welcoming manifestation, there is another one that goes the other way. This is a neo-Nazi manifestation a month ago in Poland. Neo-fascist, neo-Nazis groups are springing up everywhere in Europe. And not only Poland, this is a new fascist Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. This is Austria, Germany, even Sweden, Denmark, even Scandinavia now has fascist movements. Czech Republic, your own Mr. Wilders, Marine Le Pen in France, Israel, and of course on the other side of the Atlantic, Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump starting talking about Mexicans as rapists, as criminals, and building a wall that already exists. Then he went on to bar refugees and citizens of 7 Muslim countries. Pure racism. And then he supported neo-Nazis, groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And recently, he has been calling African immigrants coming from shithole countries. Every week, we reach a new low. This came out a couple of days ago. The Washington Post has identified 2,140 lies coming from Mr. Trump. It has been fascinating to see the press, particularly the European press and the German press, how they warn the United States of what's coming. This is before the elections. The title is Insanity. And then all these are after the elections. The end of the world as we know it. America first. This is a New Yorker after the fascist incident in North Carolina. The Economist. Der Spiegel again. And as if fascism was not enough, he also plays war games with Kim Jong-un. This is the cover of Libération that brilliantly mixes the two faces. Angela Merkel has been extraordinary in welcoming immigrants. Germany, thanks to her, welcomed 1 million immigrants. And she paid a very heavy price political capital for doing that. London elected a Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, even before Brexit. And the British people has been a vocal voice against what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic.
It's not UK policy, nor is it not our policy, nor is it a measure that this government would consider.
This is not just about the impact on British citizens. Yes. One of our closest allies has chosen to ban refugees and target Muslims. Yes. And all he can say is that, well, it wouldn't be our policy. But that is not good enough. Has he urged the US administration to lift this order, to help refugees and to stop targeting Muslims? This order was signed on Holocaust Memorial Day.
Which makes
for
it
the
so
sake
much
of history, for heaven's sake, have the guts to speak out.
The Holocaust didn't start with the gas chambers, and only days after Holocaust Memorial Day, the parallels are clear.
Underneath the stairs, when two fascist dictators, Mussolini and Hitler, were raining bombs on towns and cities in Britain. Now this government's hand in hand with another fascist, Trump. And what I say to him, do the decent thing and ban the visit. This man is not fit to walk in the footsteps of Nelson Mandela.
I do find it distasteful to make comparisons between the elected leader of a great democracy, the elected leader of a great democracy, and 1930s tyrants.
If we want to be a global leader, this government needs to show global leadership. Where is it?
Of course, this great city has had a Muslim mayor for much longer than London. It's one of the most diverse cities in the world, and we applaud it. You also had a touch of the Trump government recently that I'd like to share with you.
Speaking of threat, at one point you mentioned in a debate that there are no-go zones in the Netherlands and that cars and politicians are being set on fire in the Netherlands.
I didn't say that. That is actually an incorrect statement. Yeah, we would call it fake news.
Is that
I
fake
never
news?
said that.
Because it's what you literally said.
No, it's not what I said.
The Islamic movement has now gotten to a point where they have put Europe into chaos. Chaos in the Netherlands, there are cars being burned, there are politicians that are being burned, and yes, there are no-go zones in the Netherlands.
Yeah, we would call it fake news.
Further north, across the Atlantic, we have the extraordinary example of Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. He has not been perfect in many other areas, but in the area of the immigration, he has welcomed thousands of refugees and has put the United States to shame. And Canada is related somewhat to the death of Alan Chenou, because his aunt, Tina Chenou, lives in Canada, and she wanted to bring her family home. But they died in that journey, and only the brother survived. And here she is welcoming them. Mr. Trudeau has named a former immigrant as Minister of Immigration. His name is Ahmed Hussain. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Prime Minister of Canada. what can we do in our little art world? This is Yoko Ono. When she learned the news that Mr. Trump had been elected, she released this tweet. We have to create new models. Those models have not been invented yet. This is a group I like. It's called the Center for Political Beauty, and they are based in Berlin. And they're fighting against the new Nazism that is growing up. So in response to a politician that is one of the leaders of the Alternative for Deutschland, which is one of the fascist groups, that said that he hated the monument to the martyred Jews of Europe that is right now in Berlin. And so what they did, this group, they rented a piece of land exactly across the street from the house of this politician, and they built a replica of the monument. And they rented this land for 2 years. So when he opens his window, he's going to see the monument. This is the kind of creativity we need to confront the new fascism growing up all around us. I would like to finish with this project I did in Dallas, Texas. This is called the National Sculpture Center. It's one of the top 5 museums in the United States dedicated to sculpture. It's a building designed by Renzo Piano. They have a marvelous collection of Giacometti's. The National Sculpture Center was celebrating its 10th anniversary, and they invited me to do a project to commemorate this. In my research, I quickly discovered that it was one of the best museums in the world with a great exhibition program. But I noticed that their audience was quite limited. It was a very white and wealthy audience, the one that lives in downtown Dallas where this museum is located. And the programming was ignoring the African American community and the Latino community and the Asian community that lives all around. And so I wanted to create a project to change the demographics of this institution to incorporate the diversity of the city of Dallas. This is the sculpture garden outside of the museum. This is a Richard Serra and a Rodin. So for my project, I identified the location of the museum, which is right at the center of the city, and I searched for the hospitals. And of those hospitals, I selected those that have maternity wards where new citizens of Dallas are born. And of those, I picked 3. One is known as the Latino Hospital. The other one is known as the African American Hospital. And the third one is known as the Hospital of the Illegals. So these were 3 hospitals where new kids are born every day, and they belong to the community that is not represented in the demographics of the National Sculpture Center. This is one of the birth rooms of the Hospital of the Illegals. This is where mothers will give birth. This is when they will take the weight of the baby and will hear his first cry, telling the world that she is alive. And so I created a pavilion in the garden. It's a perfect cube that measures 7 by 7 by 7 meters, and it's made of wood and plexiglass. And it's sitting on a pool, and so we created a bridge in order to get inside the pavilion. And depending on the light, the pavilion mimetizes with the environment. Inside, there are basically chairs waiting for people to come in into a space of peace and light and silence. In the ceiling, we hid 4 speakers, and we connected these speakers to the birth rooms of all these 3 hospitals. And we wanted to capture the moment of birth, the moment when these newborns say, "I am alive." And so when people come in and they wait, and suddenly they will hear the first cry of a newborn baby. And if the baby is born at 3 p.m., 10 minutes and 5 seconds, every day at the same time, you will hear the same cry. So we started accumulating these cries. So when you enter, you might have some moments of silence, and then you might have a real concert of babies' cries, telling you, we are alive, we exist, we are here. And they belong to families that are not represented in the demographics of the museum. So to the families participating, we gave them a 1-year free membership to the museum. So they came with their friends, with their children, their parents, and they wanted to hear again the birth of their child. And so suddenly the demographics of the museum started to change. But to the babies themselves, we gave them a lifetime membership, something that didn't exist before. So these kids, when they are grown up, in 10, 15, 20 years from now, they're going to be thousands of them members for life of the institution. And hopefully, they will force the institution to change their direction and have a more diverse program. This is a couple from Iran that came to see the pavilion before giving us the sound of their child 3 days later. So for me, these kids, they are entering the museum just when they are born. But they are entering not as spectators, but as performers, as artists themselves with their own voices. The project is called Music. Everything I know, I learned the day my son was born in Dallas. I will end with these beautiful images from the Rio Olympics. It was a beautiful spectacle. The world said it was going to be a disaster because, you know, Rio is in the south, it's in Brazil, it's in the so-called third world. Nevertheless, it was one of the most gorgeous spectacles ever seen on television. I was following it for another reason. I was waiting for this moment at the beginning of the games when every country came inside the stadium in Rio, representing their countries. That was Angola, this is Japan. But I was waiting for this moment when this group came in. This is not a country. This is a group that did not exist before in the Olympics. This is called the Olympic Team of Refugees. And the Olympic Committee had decided to create this team and give them a chance to participate in this big, marvelous event of the Olympics. So here they are entering the stadium, representing not a country, but the refugees of the world. There were 10. And we don't have time here to learn about all of them. I just want to share with you the story of one of them. Her name is Yusra Mardini, and she's a swimmer from Syria. Yusra saw how her village was destroyed and decided to leave Syria with her sister Anna. So she reached Damascus and then moved on into Beirut, Lebanon. There, she was offered a refugee camp where there are 3 million more Syrians. But she didn't want to stay in a refugee camp, so she kept moving. And she reached Izmir, Turkey. Same thing, she was offered a refugee center. She said, no, I'm going to keep moving. She made it to the Aegean Sea. She went on a boat with some 30 people and her sister. But unfortunately, in the middle of the journey, the boat started sinking, like so many boats. And she thought, I'm not going to die in the water. I'm a swimmer. So she decided to do something. So she asked her sister Anna and 3 strong men to help her and to swim, pushing the boat. And they did that. And it took them 6 hours. But they reached Lesbos in Greece. And they got there alive. From Greece, she continued to Macedonia. From there, she went to Belgrade. Still continuing her journey to Budapest. And in spite of the fences and the walls being built by Mr. Orban, she was able to go through. And she made it to Vienna. And from there, finally, the last leg of her journey was to reach Berlin, where she now lives. And she arrived in Berlin the same day that this image of Alan Shannon was published in the newspapers of the world. She was so happy to be in Rio. She was a little star. Dozens of news media interviewed her. And they asked her, how do you feel? What message would you like to tell the other refugees? She simply said, never give up. Never give up. Never give up. Thank you.